all, and thank you for the previous speakers who've sort of set the scene. I guess it's probably been at the back of your mind for quite a few of you that one of the key challenges in restoring nature in New Zealand is dealing with introduced mammalian predators. And so that's what I'm going to focus on, and like the other speakers, I'm just part of a much bigger team. Deb Wilson from Landcare Research is also here in the room, and there's people from Waikato, Dunedin, Victoria University of Wellington, all contributed. So, talking about the urban mammal section, and again we had some fairly basic questions. A lot of research has been done on mammals in New Zealand, but usually in the bush, in natural habitats. So we wanted to collect some baseline information on abundance and distribution, and we surveyed across 6 cities, 3 habitats at 2 different times of year. I'll explain that in a bit more detail later. We wanted to develop and evaluate monitoring tools, so there's kind of standard operating protocols that DOC have developed for the backcountry. We wanted to know how can we adapt them so they work in urban situations. And then ultimately we wanted to be able to come up with some way of predicting what predator activity might look like in urban landscapes. And another major aim was to relate predator control effort, so how much effort you put into predator control, to how effective is it in terms of controlling the predators, and then how does that flow on to the effects for biodiversity, which is why we're doing this in the first place. So this is the kind of schematic way I tend to think of it. We have a kind of sliding scale of intensity of predator control. Just go, yeah. And we can increase that, and as you ramp up the predator control, we expect the predator numbers to go down, and as the predator numbers go down, we expect the biodiversity benefits to go up. And associated with that, we also expect a lot of social benefits, such as community engagement and getting to know your neighbours. But these relationships, it's not a nice, neat one-to-one relationship. And my colleague from Landcare Research, Neil Fitzgerald, described it as a bit like driving a car when you've got rubber bands connecting your wheel to the steering wheel to the axle. And so sometimes you turn really hard and nothing happens. Other times you make a small adjustment, but in a small effort, and you get a big response. And this will depend on a lot of factors. It might depend on where you're trapping, whether it's a forest reserve or in people's back gardens. They're common places to trap. What type of trapping you're doing, what sort of predators you're focused on, and so on. So we're trying to hopefully tease out these relationships a little bit better. So the study areas, the study sites, 6 cities. You'll see Nelson's in there, and the key sites were Hamilton, Wellington, and Dunedin. And the species are rats, and it's important to note that there's 2 types of common rats in New Zealand, Norways and ship rats. We know a little bit about their difference in ecology, again in forests, but not so much in the urban areas. And around most of the world, Norway rats are the common and often the only rat found in urban centres. They're the larger rat. But in New Zealand, ship rats are usually the more common one in urban spaces. And they're definitely the more common one in the forest. Then there are mice, as Nikki mentioned, hedgehogs, mustelids, possums, and particularly in urban areas, cats of special interest. And so we divided the urban habitat into 3 very broad categories. Amenity spaces, as Nikki described, are kind of grassy recreational areas with bushes and shrubs. There's remnant forest patches that may have been planted from scratch, or they might be original remnants. And then there's all the sort of backyard residential gardens. And very little survey effort's ever been put into gardens, at least for mammals. And we had 4 or 8 transects per city for habitat type. That's what it looks like in Dunedin, Hamilton, here's Nelson. So that map you've seen before, just highlighting the places where mammal monitoring was done. So lizard monitoring was done in 12 sites, but mammal monitoring in Nelson, because we didn't have fortunately the resource to do it to the same intensity, it was a one-off survey done in the amenity spaces in the forest reserves. And the methods were fairly standard tools you're probably familiar with: tracking tunnels, chew cards, and trail cameras. And again, we modelled it on the standard DOC processes in forests. So we aimed for 10 tracking tunnels in a line with 50 metre spacing between the tracking tunnel. Close to each tracking tunnel was a chew card, and then along the line, 2 trail cameras, sort of at least 200 metres apart. And there's some pros and cons of these different methods. Tracking tunnel indices are well known. It's fairly easy to interpret the footprints. They're inexpensive. Click on forward. Chew cards are kind of a development from wax tags. They work quite well for possums, but also for detecting rats. They're very cheap. One unfortunate aspect of those, they're made of plastic, and when rats chew them, can leave a lot of frass beneath them. And then the trail cameras are really good because they pick up a whole range of species and a lot of things that you might miss with tunnels and chew cards. But they are more expensive. They generate a lot of data in terms of, you can quickly accumulate thousands of gigabytes of photos if you've got quite a few cameras out there. So first we tested the sensitivity of chew cards compared to tracking tunnels, and found that on the left, chew cards were the most sensitive tool for picking up possums, slightly better picking up rats than tunnels, but not that different. Mice again turned up slightly more in tracking tunnels, whereas hedgehogs were detected very frequently in tracking tunnels, much more so than they were on chew cards. And again, even small details of the method could matter, because our chew cards were nailed in at 30 centimetres above the ground. There's a study in Auckland where they nailed them 20 centimetres above the ground, and they were getting a lot higher rate of detecting hedgehogs, maybe just because they were that little bit lower in reach of hedgehogs. So we've had long discussions about where to place the peanut butter. These differences do matter. So the key is in monitoring to try and standardise things and keep them the same. I said to someone over tea this morning, when you're trapping, sometimes the key is to vary your method to catch the ones that don't like peanut butter. Well, then you could use Nutella or whatever else you like. Compared to that, we also looked at what's the consistency of interpreting from these tools, and so those are the numbers. So two different people, without knowledge of what the other one had said, had to interpret the same tracking card or the same chew card, and this was the percentage agreement. So pretty high consistency with tracking tunnels, except for interpreting possum marks on them, whereas with the chew card there's a 91% agreement of possum chew marks, but hedgehog chew marks were down to 72%. So I guess there's no one tool that's perfect for every species. So if you want to understand the entire sort of predator community, you might need to use several tools. Well, you probably could use cameras, but they are a bit more expensive. So here's what we found. So I've just taken the spring 2018 survey, because that was the one time that Nelson did get included, and compared it to the other 3 cities that we've been doing more regularly. And so the different colours are the different species, and then they're grouped, the different colours are the different cities, and they're grouped together for the 5 most common species. And there's also a sort of potentially a bit of a latitudinal gradient, so starting with Hamilton in the north, moving to Dunedin in the south, hedgehog numbers seem to increase as you go south, and jumping across, possum numbers also possibly increase as you go south, or maybe it's more a function of how much forest habitat you've got in your city, or maybe it's a function of how much possum control the city council's doing. So all these factors come into it. Rat numbers declined as we headed south, and Nelson in the bright green actually had the distinction of having the lowest rat tracking rate, only a couple of percent on chew cards, and actually 0% on the 80 tracking tunnels that were put out at that time. You'll also notice that mustelids, so stoats, weasels and ferrets, are very rarely detected, and again that's partly a function of maybe the detection methods aren't great, but also we do believe that those species are quite rare within urban habitats, and of the 3 mustelids, it's usually weasels that are picked up in trapping in urban situations. It's a bit more detail breaking it down by the different seasons. It's the main thing to notice, and also by the different habitat types. So within Dunedin, comparing the amenity with the forest and the residential, the thing that jumps out on there is that the possums, the orange colour, they were nearly always found at almost at 100% rate in forest in Dunedin. That's kind of what we'd expect from what we know of their biology. Hedgehogs were pretty high, at over 50% across all the habitats, and rats were also pretty consistent at around 25% in all the habitats. And also the seasonal differences, and there's a lot of detail, but what I'll point out is this line that jumps up and down, that's mice in Wellington and mice in Dunedin, so they have much higher detection rates in autumn. But if we then go to the camera data, so this is the across the 3 different habitats. in Hamilton over 2 seasons. The bars are how many were detected of each species in each habitat by tracking tunnels or chew cards, but then the number of camera triggers was much higher. So you'll notice we never detected cats falling through tunnels because they can't fit. But they were the most commonly detected species on cameras. So actually there's an awful lot of cats out there, a lot of cat activity. Maybe it was the same cat coming back several times, but it's still activity that we detected, a number of triggers. Hedgehogs, that matched our impression from tracking tunnels, were quite high up there. Rats, again, more camera triggers than there were tracks detected. But I guess whatever method you're using, each method has its own sort of bias, and again, consistency is the key. And so I guess we're developing these methods, and I guess it could be quite useful in the long term if community groups and councils were able to converge on a sort of reasonably consistent set of monitoring methods, and then that would make it easier to benchmark across different cities and start to understand how does the management or the particular context of each city influence the predator community, and then especially that question of how does management actually change things and how does it have flow-on biodiversity benefits. I'll just skip over that one. So to understand how management does affect these things, we've looked at particular reserves where pest control has been intensified. So we have some data from before the intensification and after the intensification in particular reserves. And in Wellington, that intensification is very intense. It's an attempt to eradicate rats and stoats, and possums have already been eradicated from Miramar Peninsula. So we have 4 seasons of data before that eradication began. The first monitoring since they attempted it, we didn't detect any rats or mustelids or possums, and also no mice. So actually the rat control seemed to have got rid of the mice. Now that might be a temporary thing. We also know from the monitoring that Predator-Free Wellington have done that they haven't completely eradicated yet. They probably got rid of 99% of the rats and the mice. We're yet to see, so this is jumping forward. Yeah. We're yet to see what the flow-on biodiversity effects are going to be, but Nikki and her team are monitoring lizards. We've also got wetter motels out, and we're monitoring invertebrates through pitfall traps as well. And the city is doing bird count, because at that scale you might start to actually expect some changes in the bird community that could be localised to Miramar Peninsula. It's about 800 hectares. So, yes, yeah. Rats and mice are now down at levels that we couldn't detect with our surveys, but Predator-Free Wellington have found a few hotspots that are flaring up, and then they're kind of jumping on them as and when they detect them. Another source of data is that collected by community groups and councils that do trapping. So, and we see the 2 colours here are trapping in backyards and trapping in reserves. So different groups organise themselves differently, where they record the data into centralised databases like TrapNZ or even somebody's spreadsheet. They can share that with us. We're able to see some seasonal patterns, the peak of mouse trapping in sort of February, March and April. Hedgehog activity drops off in August, September. And then this was giving from the trap data an estimate of where the highest likelihood of different species being trapped was. So for rats, it was actually along the coast, whereas for mice, it was kind of the inverse. It was inland and closer to rivers and streams. But for stoats and weasels, and again, this is, well, yeah, a lot of trapping effort going on around Wellington, so there are some reasonable numbers behind this. And again, stoats and weasels showed hotspots around the coast. And then some future work that's sort of just getting underway is to do some more detailed behavioural ecology of the different predators, trying to understand the difference, for example, between ship rats and Norway rats, and what their actual home range is in an urban environment. In a bush environment, they might travel 100 metres or more. In the home range, it looks like in urban centres, possibly that shrinks down to 50 or 60 metres. And that has implications for how intensively you have to place control devices like bait stations and traps. If you leave a gap in your network, then you're just going to have sources of reinfestation. So that's some locations. Each colour is a different individual rat that's been radio-collared and then relocated at different times in the future. So some very small home ranges, although the number of relocations also needs to increase to be more confident about that. So I guess the concluding message is that there's still a lot of basic ecology to be learned about the behaviour and habitat use of mammals in cities. The ambition to control mammals continues to grow. I mean, there's increasing number of predator-free suburb and trapping groups, community groups popping up everywhere. Social and technological advances continue to be developed, but they'll need to be developed even further to really get on top of things. And biodiversity gains in cities are not just possible, but they're really essential part of turning around the biodiversity crisis and the extinction of experience. So that was, I guess, the social element that's been mentioned by a couple of speakers, that we might not be facing extinctions of everything if we've got predators around. Some things can tolerate it, but their populations will be depressed, and the probability that the average individual will actually see a kaka or see a caribou or whatever goes down with, I guess, the more predators there are around. So there's no reason why we couldn't have giraffe weevil as well as geckos and whiteheads and caribou in our city. And I've got a separate talk, which I'm not going to give, about the great caribou count and some of the results related to Nelson, but it will be on the website if people want to look at that. Thank you.